The Hittites were one of the great powers of the Bronze Age Near East. Their political center was located in central Anatolia, in present-day Turkey, and their capital was Atusha, near modern Bozaskale. The formation of the Hittite kingdom is generally placed between the beginning and the middle of the 17th century BC. In Anatolia were cities, local Hattic traditions, and a dense network of trade contacts with Mesopotamia already existed. Scholars believe that the Hittites belonged to the Anatolian branch of the Indo-European languages, but their state did not emerge in a vacuum. It absorbed pre-existing populations, cults, and traditions, especially Hattic and Hurrian ones. For this reason, Hittite civilization was from the very beginning a composite world, not an ethnically pure or isolated reality. Before the empire proper, Anatolia had gone through a phase of local kingdoms and city-states. An important figure from the origins is ruler of Kushara, known from a text later copied by Hittite scribes. In that account, Anita conquered Zatusha and cursed it, which makes what happened later even more interesting. A later Hittite ruler, traditionally identified as Or, took over the site and turned it into the capital of the new kingdom. This passage clearly shows how Hittite historical memory preserved both dynastic traditions and political texts used to build identity and legitimacy. With the so-called Old Kingdom, the Hittites began to expand their power decisively. Atushili I, one of the first great kings, consolidated power in Anatolia and launched campaigns toward northern Syria, a crucial region because it controlled trade, wealthy cities, and strategic routes between Anatolia and Mesopotamia. His successor Murshili I pushed this expansion even further. He is especially famous for the capture of Aleppo and for the expedition against Babylon, which the Hittites even managed to sack around the 16th century BC. This episode was extraordinary because it showed that an Anatolian kingdom could strike at the heart of great Mesopotamian politics. However, that enterprise did not produce lasting control over Babylon. It was more a display of force than a durable conquest. After this phase of ascent, the kingdom went through a long period of dynastic crises, with palace murders, unstable successions, and the weakening of central power. The Hittite sources themselves recount these tensions, and they are especially valuable because they show us not only military propaganda, but also the memory of internal conflict. At this stage, the name of Telepinu emerges, author of a famous edict that sought to restore order in the royal succession and limit dynastic violence. The Edict of Telepinu is one of the most important documents for understanding how the Hittites thought about kingship, law, and the continuity of the state. It is not only a legal norm, but also a political reflection on the fragility of power. With the so-called New Kingdom, or Hittite Empire, the period of greatest splendor began. From the 14th century BC onward, especially under Suppiluliuma I, the Hittites once again became a superpower. Suppiluliuma reorganized the army, strengthened internal control, and launched decisive campaigns against the kingdom of Mitanni, also taking advantage of the international tensions of the time. In just a few decades, the Hittite Empire extended its influence over much of Anatolia and northern Syria, imposing a network of vassal kingdoms and alliances that made Ati one of the great protagonists of the Bronze Age international system, alongside Egypt, Assyria, and Babylon. One of the most famous episodes of this period concerns Egypt. After the death of Tutankhamun, an Egyptian queen, whom Hittite sources call Dahamunzu, wrote to the Hittite king asking for one of his sons in marriage, because she did not want to marry a subject. The episode is known mainly from Hittite texts, and is extraordinary because it shows how deeply intertwined diplomacy, dynastic crises, and international relations were. Suppiluliuma I, at first suspicious, eventually decided to send the prince Zenonza, who however died or was killed before reaching Egypt. The affair caused severe tensions and ranks among the most dramatic moments of late Bronze Age diplomacy. The Hittite Empire was not only a military machine, it was also a highly sophisticated administrative state, based on cuneiform writing, archives, treaties, inventories, ritual texts, prayers, oracles, and administrative instructions. The tablets found at Bogaskoy Azatusha form the main foundation of nearly everything we know about the Hittites. UNESCO considers them essential documentary material for understanding their civilization, and the Great Archive of Bogaskoy has been inscribed in the Memory of the World Register since 2001. These tablets do not speak only of wars and kings, but also of religion, economy, law, relations with vassals, foreign cults, ritual fears, and the practical problems of the state. Hittite religion was extremely inclusive and layered. Not by chance, Atusha has been called the city of 1,000 gods. The Hittites adopted and reworked Anatolian, Hattic, Hurrian, and Mesopotamian deities, creating a vast pantheon. One of the most impressive places linked to this religiosity is Yazilikaya, the rock sanctuary not far from the capital, where processions of gods and goddesses carved in relief appear on the rock walls. Yazilikaya is one of the masterpieces of Hittite art and one of the strongest testimonies of their sacred and royal ideology, especially in the link between the king and the cosmic order. On the artistic and monumental level, the Hittites did not leave us realistic portraits in the modern sense of the term, but rather reliefs, seals, orthostats, monumental sculptures, and official images of the ruler. The gates of Atusha, such as the Lion Gate and the King's Gate, clearly display the visual language of Hittite power. Fortifications, protective figures, images of kingship, and religious symbols. The capital's large-scale urban planning also speaks to their organizational level. Massive walls, temples, upper and lower districts, ceremonial spaces, and monumental entrances. UNESCO specifically emphasizes the significance of Sadatusha for its urban organization, architecture, and preserved monumental remains. One of the most famous moments in Hittite history is the clash with the Egypt of Ramesses II in the Battle of Kadesh, fought around 1274 BC against the Hittite king Muwatalli II. The battle became famous above all thanks to Egyptian propaganda, which presented it as the pharaoh's personal triumph. But today historians read it much more cautiously. The outcome was probably indecisive on the tactical level, while on the strategic level the Hittites maintained a strong influence in Syria. Even more important than the battle was what came afterward. A few years later, Egypt and Zati concluded a peace treaty, known as the Treaty of Kadesh, or the Eternal Treaty, which is one of the oldest complete peace treaties preserved. Its importance is enormous for the history of international law and diplomacy. Hittite treaties are an extraordinary source even beyond Kadesh. We know, for example, of the treaty between Muwatalli II and Alexshandu of Wilusa, preserved in fragments and extremely important also, because Wilusa is often cautiously linked to the Troy of Greek sources. We also have the treaty between Muwatalli II and Talmi Saruma of Aleppo, which shows how the Hittites governed territories and local dynasties through legal agreements and formally regulated relationships of subordination. This network of texts reveals an empire that rested not only on war, but also on documentation, oaths sworn before the gods, and administrative memory. In the 13th century BC, the empire again reached high levels of political complexity under Sadesh-Ali III and Tudawaliya IV. This period also includes the famous bronze tablet, found at Bogaskoy in 1986, an exceptional document because Hittite texts are usually written on clay. The tablet records a treaty between Tudaliya IV and Kurunta of Tarhuntasha, crucial for understanding the political geography. the relationships between dynastic branches, and the internal tensions of the empire's final phase. The fact that such an important agreement was inscribed on bronze shows its symbolic and legal value. The end of the Hittite Empire, at the beginning of the 12th century BC, belongs within the broader Bronze Age collapse in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East. There is no single universally accepted cause. Scholars point to a combination of factors: internal conflicts, external pressures, supply difficulties, the breakdown of trade networks, regional crises, climate changes, and the general instability that struck many of the great states of the time. Hattusha was abandoned, and the great central kingdom disappeared as a unified power. However, the Hittites did not vanish into nothingness. In Syria and southeastern Anatolia, Neo-Hittite or Syro-Anatolian kingdoms survived, preserving Hittite cultural, dynastic, and religious elements for centuries. For a long time after their political disappearance, the Hittites were almost forgotten. Their modern rediscovery is one of the most fascinating stories in the archaeology of the Near East. The real turning point came with the systematic excavations at Bogoskoi begun in 1906 by Hugo Winkler and Theodore Macready. Those campaigns brought to light thousands of cuneiform tablet fragments and made it possible to identify the site with ancient Hattusha, the capital of the Hittites. Since then, the site has been the object of almost continuous research, with major archaeological missions that have radically transformed our knowledge of the Hittite world. Another decisive milestone was the decipherment of the Hittite language. In 1917, Becek Roznai published the work that demonstrated the Indo-European character of Hittite, opening a new era in the study of the ancient Near East. Thanks to this decipherment, historians were finally able to read not only names and diplomatic formulas, but entire corpora of laws, rituals, annals, prayers, treaties, and administrative texts. Hittite is now recognized as the oldest extensively attested Indo-European language. Archaeological campaigns at Bogoskoi Hattusha have continued for more than a century, and new discoveries concern not only buildings or objects, but also the linguistic and cultural landscape of the empire. In 2023, for example, a previously unknown Indo-European language was identified in a ritual text found at Hattusha, the so-called language of Kalashma. This discovery is important, not only for linguistics, but also because it confirms how much the Hittite archive was an extraordinary container of regional traditions, translations, rituals, and diverse cultures incorporated by the imperial administration. The material history of the discoveries has also seen significant developments. Some objects unearthed during the early 20th century excavations ended up outside Turkey, and in recent times there have been cases of restitution or repatriation, such as that of the Bogoskoi Sphinx. This shows that the history of the Hittites is not only about the second millennium BC, but also about the way archaeology, museums, and modern states manage ancient heritage. Today, the Bogoskoi Museum displays models, reliefs, inscriptions, and artifacts that help reconstruct the religious, military, and administrative life of Hittite civilization. If we look at the Hittite story as a whole, we see a civilization that was at the same time warlike, diplomatic, archival, and deeply religious. The Hittites were able to build an imperial state capable of dealing with Egypt, Babylon, Assyria, and Mitanni from a position of strength. They were able to organize a monumental capital in the heart of Anatolia. They were able to turn writing into an instrument of government and memory, and they were able to absorb different cultures instead of completely erasing them. Their history stretches from the Anatolian roots of the early 2nd millennium BC to the collapse of the Bronze Age, but their legacy survived in the Neo-Hittite kingdoms, in diplomatic documents, in rock sanctuaries, in monumental reliefs, and above all, in the thousands of tablets that continue to give back their voice.